Hi BookTube, and welcome to a nonfiction review. My nonfiction, so far this year, when I look back on it, it's been a bit Eurocentric and therefore off balance. It's time, I think, for a change of locale. What I'm hankering to read, if I could, is a book recommended by Mike at Riff Raff's Reading Renaissance. It's Andre Odendaal's The Founders, and it is the history of the ANC. And that would have to be a purchase. I can't find a library copy. And if I may confess, I think I've spent enough money on new books, well, new to me, in 2026 so far. I kind of have to pull back. So what I'm going to do in the interim, until I feel better about buying new books, is to read another work about South Africa that, as it happens, I already own. Today we're looking at After Mandela, The Battle for the Soul of South Africa, written by Alec Russell, published in 2010, 324 pages of which 289 are the text. There are other editions of this book with a different title called Bring Me My Machine Gun, but I'm going to be talking about this edition, which I purchased not long ago, spring of 2025, actually, when we were in Hay-on-Wye for a day, and I was browsing in Richard Booth's books, and I think I saw the title page and thought, yeah, you need to know more about South Africa, what you know. There'd be space left on the back of a postage stamp, even after writing very small. So I felt I did need a book, so I picked this one up. It's not strictly about events after Mandela. I think what Russell is expecting is a non-South African reading audience, people who pay attention to the news, who read the kind of newspapers he worked for, the Telegraph and the Financial Times. But unless you yourself act like a foreign correspondent and you pick a country or a region and you follow it in detail, then what's going to happen is you catch some details and you miss others. So what this book is aiming to do is to add details to what might be a more or less sketchy grasp of the political decisions which were taken by the ANC under Presidents Mandela and Mbeki, and speculating a bit on the presidency of Jacob Zuma, since this book was published not long after he was elected. The author, Alec Russell, was born in 1966 in England. He went to Oxford University. It was hard to find details, but I got the feeling he graduated perhaps 87 or 88. Russell admits he wasn't a student journalist, and I wasn't able to find an interview where he talked about why did he choose journalism as a career. But shortly after graduation, he became a foreign correspondent. He worked in the Balkans during the conflict in the early 90s. And then he became the Telegraph foreign correspondent in South Africa and was there for 5 years between 1994 and 1999. Very exciting years to be in South Africa. Then he went and did a stint in the early 2000s covering the Iraq War. And then he came back to South Africa around 2007 for a stint, this time working for the Financial Times. And he is currently the foreign editor for the Financial Times. He has written another book about Africa more generally, 1999, Big Men, Little People, Encounters in Africa. His dispatches from Southern Africa have earned him nominations for the 2008 Pulitzer Prize and also for British Foreign Correspondent of the Year. A quick look at the structure of this book. There is a 10-page introduction, 12 chapters, average pages per chapter is 24. The text in the paperback edition that I have is small, it's 10 point. However, the text is double-spaced on the page. Doesn't allow page margins if you need to annotate the book, if that's what you were looking for. The style is, imagine serious long-form news journalism of the type that you get in, say, Time magazine or New Statesman. The vocabulary is straightforward, but the paragraphs are longer. They're often a third to a half a page each and dense with information. Each chapter is a thematic examination. It considers how the ANC government under Mandela and then under Mbeki differed in the way power was held and exercised, the changes that each president tried to make happen, and also noting the ways in which the ANC differed or not from other African liberation movements which became ruling parties of their countries. I felt it was noticeable how even-handed Russell was trying to be when discussing successes and failures, pros and cons, how he often reframed the same issue from different vantage points. And the effect, I think, was to emphasize the seriousness of the failure, while at the same time emphasizing the complications and the conflicts of interest which undermine good political intentions anywhere, but particularly in South Africa. The resources you can see are extensive. There is a country map. I wouldn't say that's very detailed, but again, I don't think that this book is aiming itself at a South African reader. I think it is definitely aiming itself at European readership, a person who caught the news here and there from the late 1980s onwards. I recognize a few names, and some years ago I read Nelson Mandela's Long Walk to Freedom, which focused on his years in prison on Robben Island. That still leaves a lot of gaps. And so I think for a European reader like me, Russell's book is good in that it gives you that sort of sweeping survey of the two presidencies. However, it's also quite overwhelming in terms of the amount of information it gives. He definitely knew his subject and had important contexts. So what it was good for doing for me was giving me stepping stones onto other books, realizing where I lacked knowledge and where, if I wanted something more in depth, I was going to have to seek another book, perhaps from his bibliography. I won't summarize the whole book chapter by chapter. That would just take so much time. What I'm going to do is pick 3 random chapters and just show exactly how Russell moves through his topic in question. Each of his chapters, I think, could easily be expanded into book-length manuscripts of and by themselves, right? So reading After Mandela really just gives you a sketch of a topic, so you're a little bit more informed if all you knew before that time was a sentence or less. And then, as I say, the bibliography and the notes can serve as signposts pointing to more in-depth sources. So I'm going to look first at chapter 1, which was titled Succeeding a Saint. And Russell talks about the speculation just prior to Mandela's release from prison about what kind of leader he would turn out to be. And the emphasis of the opening pages of the chapter are about Mandela's talent for conciliatory rhetoric, or Russell also plays devil's advocate and relabels that talent as the ability to play an audience. But either way, you see that the perception in those early years of Mandela's rule was always that he occupied the moral high ground somehow. And I do think that outside of South Africa, that aura it lasted in spite what might have been happening in detail on the ground. And Russell does go into some detail. Mbeke, Russell felt, took a different view of how morality worked when dealing with other African nations. And I'm going to read a short passage from pages 15 and 16 now, which introduce the topic, but I'm really reading them also to give you a sense of Russell's writing style. Mandela's voluble human rights foreign policy would always have to be tempered by a dose of realpolitik. A defining moment for Mbeke came during Mandela's presidency when the Nigerian military junta hanged the Nigerian writer Ken Saro-Wiwa, spurning Mandela's pleas for clemency. Outraged, Mandela pushed for sanctions against the junta, only to find that the rest of Africa was not behind him, and he had to back down. At the next meeting of the ANC's National Executive Committee, Mbeke excoriated Mandela over the debacle. Never again should South Africa break ranks with its fellow African states, he argued. The logic of trying to solve crises via diplomacy and forging alliances rather than by shouting from the rooftops is clear, but Mbeke took that to such an extreme with his policy of not speaking out about Mugabe's excesses that he was to be accused of appeasing a tyrant. When asked a year into his own presidency how the crisis in Zimbabwe would be resolved, he responded munificently. He was addressing a briefing at Windsor Castle, where he had spent the previous night at the start of a state visit to the old colonial power. He was a guest of the Queen, whose forebear had sent armies to fight his Xhosa ancestors 150 years before. Dressed, as was his wont, in a charcoal grey suit, he looked very much at home. African leaders in a new regional initiative he was founding would bring rogue leaders to heel, he said. A peer review mechanism would ensure that rules of good governance in Africa were upheld. He moved on to discuss global trade with the editor of The Economist. This was classic Mbeki. He probably had a better understanding of how Africa fitted into the world's economy than any other African leader. His authoritative style of leadership helped to ensure that Africa was on the agenda at summits of world leaders. Yet he had a more cryptic side to his character. He was also known for so cloaking his pronouncements in policy jargon and so gliding them in subclauses that when you reread them, it was all but impossible to ascertain his thinking or to pin him down. He made repeated pledges to world leaders that he was on the brink of a breakthrough in Zimbabwe. Initially, the West was happy for him to take the lead. It made sense to defer to the region's dominant power and also to try to talk Mugabe out of power. But by the end, after several deeply flawed elections blithely endorsed by South Africa, few believed his repeated claim that a deal was in sight. Western officials and Zimbabwean opposition leaders came to believe that Mbeki had no interest in reaching an agreement and would rather maintain solidarity with a fellow African leader than stand up for the trampled human rights of ordinary Zimbabweans. Chapter 8 in the book is titled Graves of the Ancestors, and it looks closely at the whole topic of land redistribution. And it begins with a quote from Thabani Kumalo, who was an ANC member in 2008. And he said, Mandela was very smart. He said, land reform. Oh, not my baby. That's why the world called him an icon. Had he embarked on land reform, the iconization would have gone. And the historical details in this chapter are brief. Russell mentions the 1913 Land Act in just a sentence, and then he notes how the National Party took stronger measures to restrict non-white land ownership after 1948. And then he just goes on from there. Then Russell recounts one example of enforced resettlement from Charleston, interviewing the former residents and describing a visit to the area that is looking for signs of the original community. Russell then segues into the present day to discuss the number of land claims that were presented to the ANC post-1994 and the difficulties of working through them, substantiating them, and even where there were substantiated claims, that doesn't necessarily equate to good news for the claimants. Russell cited one example of a successful cooperative farm where resettlement had taken place, but he also mentions the obstacles which have faced some other resettlers: lack of financial support, lack of training to ensure that they could make the land productive. And I think I must include chapter 10, titled The 100% Zulu Boy, which is painting a portrait of Zuma's background and his involvement in anti-apartheid resistance, with a focus on the political effort made from 2006 through to 2009 by Zuma and his supporters to position him to take over the presidency from Mbeki. Russell shares some private correspondence between himself and Thabo Mbeki while Mbeki was still president, and I think it serves to show how different the intellectual Mbeki was from Zuma, but I think it also is a demonstration of Russell's insider access at that time to government officials. Several pages in the chapter are devoted to details about 2006 when Zuma was put on trial for the rape of a daughter of a family friend, and how instead of damaging Zuma's political prospects, the trial actually boosted popular identification of Zuma as a martyr, and that his liberty was somehow identified with Black South African liberty from an ANC government which had not greatly altered the material circumstances of most Black South Africans. And Russell ends chapter 10 then with suggestions as to what might be the real underpinning of that popular support, what made Zuma seem different and or superior to Mandela and Mbeki from the viewpoint of many South African Blacks. And for my rabbit hole, I think it's important, so that you do know what you would get out of this book, is to talk about what it will not cover in sufficient detail, just because of the focus Russell takes. After Mandela will not provide a portrait of the various ethnic groups in South Africa and any specific ways that they all contributed to the anti-apartheid struggle, or the post-apartheid government, or how government decisions affected all groups across the country. There is a chapter discussing the reactions and the difficulties of white South Africans, some mention of Zulus and Xhosa, but Russell's focus really is on specific workings and decisions of the ANC government. And information on the pre-Mandela South Africa is given only when needed to clarify the present, and it's summarized by the author, who clearly knows more. And in a similar vein, any information about the ANC pre-1994 is given on a need-to-know basis, just enough so that Russell can say that he's covered that point in a summary way. So to get the most from Russell's book, I think it helps to have some rough knowledge of 20th century South Africa. It only needs to be rough. Too much knowledge would probably render this book unhelpful, a little dull, stating the obvious, just repeating what is already known. Too little knowledge, and I could see a reader just feeling lost in places, because Russell is not inclined to background every statement he makes. He does assume that the person who's reading this book has been following the news for maybe several decades. So what he gives is minimal, because he wants to remain focused on each chapter's chosen topic. And if after the review you're judging yourself as one of those who has some knowledge but it's too little, and to be fair, I'm wary of grading myself much better than very little, let me show you a more recent publication which came out in 2021, and that is A History of South Africa 1902 to the Present, written by the Associate Professor of History at Pretoria University, Thula Simpson. I've put the book on my wish list for whenever I begin to think, okay, Heather, you can spend some money on books again. I can't obtain the book from the library I belong to, and we'll see how well I resist the pull of this title. And that is the review done. This Sunday there is going to be a Middlemarch meditation for all you who follow those regularly. The Casaubons have returned from Rome. It's a very short chapter, actually, that we will be covering. I was surprised when it ended. And anyway, we'll go into more detail with that. In the meantime, I hope you're doing well in your reading, whatever it is that you're in the middle of, and I look forward to seeing you again in a few days' time. Take care. Bye-bye.